What's up, guys, and welcome back to Moan Inc. If you guys are new here, then what is up? My name is Erica. Heya, how you doing? And if you're into the history of the ancient Greeks and the Romans, maybe you're just into the mythology, and maybe you are just here to see Nestor's little moment in Book 3 of Homer's Odyssey, well then, this is not only the video for you, this is also the channel for you. You guys are going to want to hit that subscribe button and the bell icon so that you know every single time I post in the future. But on to the topic of today's video, and as I just ruined, we're going to be talking about Book 3 of Homer's Odyssey. So if I could summarize Book 3 into one sentence, it would be that Nestor talks a lot to Telemachus about the heroes of Troy. Now, if you remember from my Iliad series, anytime I spoke about Nestor, it was just because he was blathering to the Greeks about knows what half the time. He's a very stereotypical old man in that sense, and he just sort of yammers and yammers and yammers. So a lot of this summary is going to be me saying Nestor talks a lot and I'm going to ignore it. So you will have to go back and read a lot of his rants because we will just be here all day. So with all that being said, let's just roll into the narrative. Last time I left you guys with Athena and Telemachus being on the boat, and they were going to Pylos to go and see Nestor, but Athena is in the form of Mentor. That's important because she is in the form of Mentor throughout this video until I say that she's not. So any single time I reference Athena, remember that she looks like Mentor. I might have to remind you like once or twice, but for the most part, just assume it unless I say this is Athena as Athena, right? Okay, just whew. At this point, the boat now rolls up to Pylos and they can see the beach, and there are loads of people on the beach. So they've got like lots of divisions on the beach. All of the Pylians are down there. In each division, there are 500 men, and there are 9 divisions, and each of these divisions is sacrificing 9 bulls? Yes, 9 bulls. This is off the top of my head. 9 bulls to Poseidon. That's who this whole feast is for, right? So just some numbers for you guys in total so that you can envision what Telemachus and Athena are rolling up to. There's like 4,500 people on this beach. There are 81 sacrifices taking place. That is a lot of happening for them to just roll into and be like, okay, this is something. Athena is the first one to get off the boat, and she leads Telemachus, and as they're walking, he expresses that he doesn't really know what he's going to ask, what he's going to do, and Athena tells him that actually he should calm down for one. She's like, don't worry about it, because Nestor is the wisest of the Greeks. He's known for being an incredible counselor, so she tells him, as long as you ask the questions, Nestor will reply. And I wanted to stress that in the video because I think that's something that we can take into our own lives. There are lots of things about these ancient Greek stories that I'm like, oh, this is very important to me. And Athena, most importantly, throughout, as we've seen in the Odyssey, she does this thing where she directly asks people, or has people, like Telemachus in this instance, directly ask other people the questions that they want to know the answers to, because people always give them the answers. For example, when she asked that guy to lend them his boat, right? He doesn't offer his boat. She says, hey, can we borrow your boat to go on this expedition with Telemachus? And the guy says, okay. So that's another instance here where she tells Telemachus, hey, if you want to know the answers to these questions, you need to be specific, and Nestor will give you the answers that you require. So don't worry. Telemachus is still a little bit nervous though, because he doesn't know the questions necessarily that he wants to know the answers to, apart from where the is my dad. And so she tells him to calm down, and she says, don't worry, you will find the questions in yourself when you meet Nestor, most likely. She says it's going to help when you come face to face with him and when he tells you of Troy. So like, don't worry about that. But also she says that Athena, her, will infuse him with the correct questions if he doesn't think of it. So he really is going into this like fully supported. And that, you know, calms Telemachus down just like a little bit. As the two of them are walking over to the Pylians now, who are on the beach doing that whole sacrifice thing, the two of them walk over, and Nestor's 2 sons walk up to meet them because they're like, oh my goodness, there are these strangers, how amazing. And this is part of the hospitality custom. Just want to clarify that for everybody. This is totally normal behavior in ancient Greece. So they run over, they lead them back over to where all of the sacrifices and the feast is going to take place. They sit them down. First and foremost, they have them make a sacrifice of like, well, not a sacrifice. They have them make an offering, better word, of wine to Poseidon. And it's quite funny because Nestor's son doesn't realize he's telling Athena that she has to make an offering to her uncle. And so she's a bit like, yeah, sure, I can do it according to ancient custom, no problem, because she was there. You know, like it's just, it's one of those scenes where you're like, if only everybody knew what we knew. And so Athena ends up making this little offering. She then passes the cup over to Telemachus. He then makes an offering, and then they all feast and they enjoy themselves. Once they've all put their hunger aside, Nestor then stands up and addresses the strangers, and he says, you know, thanks everybody for like coming in. That's like really nice that you came to this feast. However, now that the strangers are done eating, we would love to hear your story and where you're from, what brings you to Pylos, Helos even, I'm so sorry, but that is like a main thing that in the hospitality hall custom that guests would offer, that they would eat and then they would entertain everybody with their stories, right? So he's like, now's your time to shine, guys. Telemachus then replies, and he's like, actually, we are totally here for personal reasons. I'm here to find out about my dad, because even though a lot of people who didn't come home from Troy, we know how they died, like all of those stories have survived from Troy and made it home. He's like, we don't even know if my dad is dead, let alone how he died if he did die. And that's really all I'm here for. Like, I just want to know any information you happen to have about Odysseus, my father. And that's when Nestor sort of like clocks into the conversation. He's just like, oh my goodness, you're Odysseus's son? F off. Nestor's reply, I kid you the f not, is 4 pages long. Like, it is so typical Nestor. Single-sided, to be fair to him, but still, it is just line after line after line, and you don't get to Odysseus until about halfway through, right? So in true Nestor fashion, he's just like, great, so Odysseus is your dad, but this memory of Odysseus reminds me of so many other things from the Trojan War. And he like lifts off, you know, like Achilles' death, how they like got into the city, all of this sort of stuff that you're like, that has all to do with Odysseus and his journey home, but thank you, Nestor. He then also reiterates how his son Antilochus died. Oh my god, it's like really sad actually. He says that there's so much that people don't know about the Trojan War that if somebody was to ask one of the heroes who was at the Trojan War to recount everything that happened, because it's like 9 years, right? Nestor remembers 9, well, in the 10th year they won, so 9 full years and then a little bit of a 10th year. There's a lot of to go through. And Nestor says, if I were to say, if any of us were to sit here and to retell what happened during the Trojan War, you could sit there for literally like 5 or 6 years and then the person who asked the question would regret it and want to go home. That is how much he says is going to be on the table. So he says, don't worry, I'm going to filter it out though. Thank Nestor is going to learn how to filter things out because we're not there yet. But he says he's going to filter it out for his purpose for Odysseus because Odysseus was one of the best. He was one of the best at tactics. He was one of the smartest ones of all the army. And also he says that Telemachus is obviously Odysseus' son because of the way that he speaks, which I think is a really nice compliment to give him, that he doesn't say, you look just like him. Of course you're Odysseus' son. That makes total sense to me. He says, you guys have the same way with words and you remind me a lot of him, which must be a really emotional moment for Telemachus, quite honestly. But it's now that actually we get the story of how everybody else got home, and not necessarily what fates all of them met, but we know how a few of them, if they were safe, how they made it home and all of this stuff. So he starts by telling us though that the Greek heroes Agamemnon and Menelaus, after they had, you know, sacked Troy and gotten Helen, they had a massive falling out, okay? The two guys ended up in this massive argument. Agamemnon wants to stay on the shores of Troy and continue sacrificing to the gods and to thank them for their victory and all of this. And Menelaus says, I want to go home because we've been away from home for so goddamn long, which I think we can all relate to. Like, you know, when you're on like a night out and it's like 5 in the morning or something and someone wants to stay out a little bit longer and you're just like, no, hell no, I'm going home like right now. It's essentially the argument that they're having. I know I just made it like a totally modern problem that so isn't the level of like issues that they're having right now, but that's how I read it. I'm like, yeah, I kind of feel both of their points, honestly, because I've been Agamemnon on a party level, obviously not on a war level, but on a party level I've been Agamemnon. Like, come on guys, it's only 5 a.m, let's go. And then I've also been Menelaus. That's like, I literally, you could pay me X amount of money and I still wouldn't stay. I'm going to my bed. So with that mentality in mind, now that you kind of understand Agamemnon and Menelaus a little bit more, Menelaus just gets in his boat and he leaves. And Nestor leaves at the same time as Menelaus, right? So that's where they go. And Agamemnon ends up staying with Odysseus, right? So there's 2 different parties. Now the Greek army has split. So Agamemnon stays, he does the little sacrifice thing, Menelaus just immediately leaves. Nestor then makes it home pretty quickly compared to literally every other hero of the Trojan War. He says he made it home, and because he made it home on the time that he expected he would make it home, that everything else that he's heard about the Greek heroes, including Odysseus, is just hearsay. He says, I don't actually know any more than you do. Like, we've all just sort of heard rumors about what's happened, and that's because they were still on the shores of Troy as I was sailing home. However, he does tell us of 3 heroes he knows for certain got home safely. First, we have the Myrmidons who made it home. So the Myrmidons make it home, which are Achilles' previous army, so they go back to where they're from. They're led now by his son Neoptolemus. Safe and sound, no problems there. The second hero that made it home with his army is Philoctetes. He was totally safe. He doesn't come up till after the Iliad, by the way, if you guys were just like, who the f is that? He's part of this whole narrative, but not in the Iliad. Either way, so he makes it home, right? And then the last one that we have is Idomeneus. I like have a massive crush on him, and I've said this throughout the Iliad series. I'm like, I don't know what it is about Idomeneus, but like as a literary man, for some reason I fancy the pants off him. The last hero that we hear about actually is Agamemnon, obviously, because this is the most famous thing that has happened, and this is the biggest piece of gossip in the ancient world currently when they're all talking. Nestor again is like, did you hear how Agamemnon got home and how he got killed? Did you hear this? And Telemachus is like, who the f hasn't. Of course I've heard of how great Orestes was, and if I got the chance to kill the suitors in the way that he got the chance to kill Aegisthus, then like, yeah, I would feel that great too, and this would be a really great moment, but it's not, okay? It's not gonna happen for me. And Nestor, funnily enough, does reply, and he says, now that you've mentioned the suitors, funny, I do remember hearing that everybody was trying to court your mother. Funny, how's that going? And you know, you're a bit like, Nestor, now's not the time you want to hear about Odysseus, enough about Penelope. But either way, he gets a little update because Nestor asks Telemachus, saying, how can you let these people come into your house and abuse you in that way? Not necessarily the word abuse. You can translate that word in that way. You know, bullied is another way that you could translate it, I guess. Sort of driven over, you know, like personality-wise. Basically, he just says, how can you allow people to treat you that way in your own home? Telemachus says that he actually doesn't even want to talk about it. He says that my victory over the suitors probably will never happen, and I've accepted that. It's just a wish that I have. And Athena, remember, she's still sitting there in the form of Mentor. She literally like whacks Telemachus, and she's like, Telemachus! No speaking like this. She stresses this moment, which I really love, and she says, you know, for the gods to save a mortal, it really is like zero effort. Like, we could do it from a mortal who's half a world away. Like, it's that easy, which I love. I just think that she's really highlighting how much the gods give zero about mortals if it's that easy to save them. But she does stress in this moment, you know, we can help mortals as much as we want. However, much like Agamemnon and much like your father and much like fate in general, we cannot save people from that. That the fates and gods are two totally different things. So she says, you know what, if you're fated to kill the suitors, I can't make you, well, she doesn't say I, obviously, because she's in the form of Mentor, but she says a god can't make you kill the suitors. In the same way that Agamemnon was going to die at the hands of Aegisthus, like, that was his fate. Like, we can't save him from that because then we're screwing with fate, and then the fates and all the underworld gods, they gonna get mad. Anyways, Telemachus understandably does not want to talk about the suitors in his house. Okay, so he redirects the conversation back to Nestor, and he just says, can you tell me how Agamemnon met his fate? How exactly did he end up dying? How did Aegisthus do all of this? Because we've heard the story, but we haven't heard, like, all the little plot points, the beats that we have to hit, right? So he asks Nestor to go through that again. He says, can you tell me how he died? But also, can you explain to me why Menelaus wasn't home? Which is a really good point, because Menelaus left before Agamemnon left for Troy. So technically he should have been in Sparta. Why didn't he hear of Aegisthus planning this whole thing? And, you know, why couldn't he have gone up to Mycenae to save his brother? All of this. He asked that question. And Nestor says, fantastic question. I shall tell you the story. Because it's Nestor and he loves an excuse to ramble. Now, this is a really interesting story because he goes on to explain how Aegisthus ended up courting Clytemnestra, who's the queen. Obviously, she's married to Agamemnon. How did he manage to do this? And apparently, she thought that the whole thing was outrageous. Like, when he showed up and he had this whole plan, she was just like, he needs to leave, right? Because she is a good woman at the beginning of this. So she's a bit like, I'm faithful to my husband. Off, you're clearly trying to cause problems. And there's apparently a bard who was arranged by Agamemnon to guard Clytemnestra because he knew that something was going to happen. And Aegisthus sees that it's probably the guard's fault, this bard who's guard, that rhymes, and I'm sorry if you guys can't really understand my accent when I say that, but it's the bard who's guard of Clytemnestra. And so Aegisthus realizes this, and he's like, I gotta get rid of that guy. So he ends up putting him on a boat and marooning him on an island, and then apparently that's all that needs to happen in order for Clytemnestra to then just like fall at her knees in front of Aegisthus, and so then he succeeds in seducing her whilst her husband is away. Which is absurd, but alas, that is the story that we hear. Now, the part of the story that's really interesting is that at this point in time, as this whole thing is happening and all of this, that Menelaus has not made it home. Why hasn't he made it home? Because he had his little Odyssey of his own, for lack of a better word, because the book is called the Odyssey after Odysseus, not after just a journey in general. It's just how we use the word now. But Menelaus literally goes to island to island to island. He's constantly being like caused to go off course, all of this. And in fact, at this moment, he's in Egypt. That was where he just ends up getting marooned at last. So he sort of waits in Egypt for a while before he ends up going on to Sparta. But he's in Egypt at this point in time. That is why he couldn't help Agamemnon. That is why he didn't hear of this whole thing that was going down. So he's in Africa, Agamemnon gets killed. And then 7 whole years later, Orestes, who's Agamemnon's son, comes back and he kills Aegisthus. I was about to forget his name, but his name is Aegisthus. And it was only then, when there's like a whole feast that's being held in Mycenae to the new king and all of this, that is when Menelaus makes it home. So he just misses this whole thing, okay? So he gets home and he hears of all of this and he's just too late because he's been stuck in Egypt the whole time. Which is a hella depressing note to end on, his little speech, and Telemachus is just kind of sitting there like, oh, right, okay. So Nestor tries to change topic of conversation and he's just like, so you should probably go back home because we don't want you to, like, you know, lose all of your possessions if all of the suitors are there and they're planning this whole thing and all of this sort of shebang. Go home because otherwise this whole journey would be worth nothing if there's nothing nothing to go home to, if that makes, like, possession-wise, if that makes sense, and mother-wise, obviously. But he does urge Telemachus before he goes home to go on to visit Menelaus, because Menelaus can tell his story a little bit better than Nestor can, and he says not to worry, because when he gets there, he should ask Menelaus all the questions that he wants to have answered, because that way he'll get the appropriate answers and he'll get what he needs from the interaction. Nestor says, go by boat if you want to, but if you want to take the land route, you totally can, and I'll give you the horses, I'll give you the chariot. I will also hand over one of my sons, Pisistratus. You will get in the chariot at the same time, and you will drive this lovely man over to visit Menelaus so that he can get the answers that he deserves. And Pisistratus is obviously sitting there just like, I will, and everybody's like, yes, you will. So that is the plan, okay? He leaves it up to Telemachus, and they end up making all of these offerings at the end of the meal, and when they both stand up, when Mentor Athena stands up and Telemachus stands up to go back to the boat, Nestor actually holds them both back, and he says, if you want to go and sleep on the boat, that's totally fine, but I would love for you guys to stay in my palace. Specifically Telemachus. This is important because Telemachus is the son of his dear friend, and so therefore it means a lot to him that he gets to host his friend's son. So he's like, Telemachus, gotta stay in the palace. But Mentor, if you would like to, you can go back to the boats, whatever you guys can pick. If you would like to just leave 2 men at the boats to guard the boats and have the rest of the men come into the palace, that is also fine. And before Telemachus can reply, Athena, as Mentor, says, it's fine. Telemachus will stay inside. Telemachus will also go to Sparta by land. He will take you up on that offer because that's a respectable thing to do. Meanwhile, I will go back to the boats. I will sleep on the boats and the rest of the men will sleep on the boats as well, and we'll handle it all in the morning. And when she turns around, she turns herself into an eagle and she off by flying. So obviously everybody is shooketh because we have about 4,500 people still on the beach, right? And they're just watching this like, what the hell? And this is quite funny because a common theme throughout the whole conversation that Nestor is having with Telemachus is that he's saying, Athena really loved your dad and she was constantly with your dad and all of this. I've never seen a mortal be loved by a god as much as Odysseus was loved by Athena. Like, that was what he said the whole time. So the fact that this happened literally must be so embarrassing for him because he's like, oh, that was clearly Athena. And he turns to Telemachus and he's just like, just so that you know, that was obviously Athena and she's with you just as much as she was with your dad. And this is a really beautiful moment and I feel really blessed to be in your company. So he then does a mini prayer at this moment to Athena, just being like, by the way, you're like super great and I'm really thankful that you were at my dinner, and I will go and make sacrifices to you when we get back to the palace, and we will make sacrifices to you in the morning and all of this. We will like be very respectable because you were here. And Athena obviously hears him and she like wants to grant him everything because Athena loves all the Greeks. So they then go back to Nestor's palace, right? They're all brought back to Nestor's palace and he brings out this bottle of wine that's been like seasoned for like 11 years. It's like super old, right? And he brings out this wine and he has everybody make a little offering to Athena and he like prays that she's going to be gracious to his family and honor his family. And obviously again, she hears him and she's like, absolutely, boo, you were so nice to me, have no fear. And then Telemachus is brought to his room, so he then goes to sleep, and then the next day everybody wakes up, right? Everybody wakes up in the palace. We do get a little cut of the next day before we move on to Menelaus' palace, and when they wake up, Nestor decides to call all of his sons, the surviving sons obviously, to a little meeting, and they're meeting outside, and he's like, right guys, we've got to get Telemachus to Menelaus' palace, so here is how we're going to do this. We first of all have to make a sacrifice, and he basically delegates all of these little jobs to his sons, and he's like, you get the heifer from the field, you get there's a smith person, not a goldsmith, there's a smith of some sort, and he ends up like covering the horns with gold of this heifer because that's respectable. And so he does that. You have somebody who's then told to go and get the knife that they're going to sacrifice this heifer with, all of this. So he delegates all these little jobs, and as he's doing this, then Telemachus is getting like bathed by his daughter, not Telemachus' daughter, obviously by Nestor's daughter, which again is a very normal practice in ancient Greece. Don't think it was like a sexy thing. It wasn't. She's just being very nice. She then puts all of this like nice oil on him, so he's gonna look really nice when he goes to Menelaus' palace, by the way. It looks good for Nestor if Telemachus shows up and he's bathed and he looks really nice and he's really well clothed, right? That's the whole point of this. So Telemachus looks really good. They make the whole sacrifice. They do the correct rituals and all this. They then get Pisistratus, who is Nestor's son, as I've mentioned, get him into the chariot, get Telemachus into the chariot, and then they ride the off to Sparta. But on their way to Sparta, it's a really long journey, so then they have to stop off at night. They stop at this place called Thera first, and they end up being received by this king there who just like knows them because, again, hospitality in the ancient world. So they then stay there throughout the night. Then in the morning, they get back in the chariot, and then they ride off to Menelaus' palace, and that is where we are left with the story. Yay! So if you would like to see the last book of the Telemachy, which will be done next time, so that is book 4, and then after that, we finally meet Odysseus. So book 5 is when we meet Odysseus. We are nearly there at this point. I know that I've gotten a lot of comments already of people being like, when is Odysseus showing up? But the whole point of this is to show you this grandeur, to show you like that his homecoming is this really big deal. This is a very exciting moment. And when we meet him, it's just like, oh, finally we get to meet our hero. So thank you guys so much for watching this episode. And don't forget to tune in next time to see how Menelaus and Telemachus get on with their little chat. So we'll see you guys next time.